The humans of Europe, 350,000 years ago, did not live lives of quiet desperation. They lived lives of adventure and adrenaline-seeking. By the time barefoot feet pressed into hot ash on the slopes of Rockamonfina volcano 350,000 years ago, Europe's humans were already something closer to ultimate adventure athletes than the cautious foragers of popular imagination. The footprints do not just show movement across a volcano. They expose a body built to tolerate extremes, cold, heat, instability, pain, and to do so repeatedly, as part of ordinary life. Start with the feet themselves. Barefoot locomotion across volcanic ash and jagged ground implies plantar fat pads far thicker than those of most modern humans, combined with a distribution of pressure that protected bones and soft tissue under load. This is not simply a matter of toughness or courage, it is anatomy. Pain perception would have been modulated differently, nerve endings conditioned by lifelong exposure rather than insulated from it. Modern humans flinch because our nervous systems are calibrated for protection. These people endured because their bodies were calibrated for function. Cold was no less extreme than heat. Europe, between 350,000 years ago, oscillated between temperate and harsh conditions, with cold snaps that would have punished exposed skin and extremities. Yet hands and feet remained functional. Thick cortical bone, dense trabecular structure, and a metabolism tuned toward heat retention meant circulation could be maintained in fingers and toes long after modern humans would lose dexterity. You cannot shape wood, strike stone, or climb rock with numb hands. These people did all three. Strength was not optional. Middle Pleistocene Europeans, such as the individual represented by the Soprano and Arago skulls, were massively built, not in the stylized way of bodybuilders, but in the way of people whose skeletons were continuously loaded. Thick limb bones, wide joint surfaces, powerful muscle attachments, and short distal segments minimized heat loss and maximized torque. This was a physique optimized for climbing, hauling, and resisting injury. When they climbed slopes like Rockamonfina, they were not gambling fragile bodies against gravity. They were deploying bodies designed to absorb shock and recover. What the Rockamonfina footprints ultimately expose is not just daring movement across a volcano, but a physiology and mindset tuned for confrontation with dangerous environments and dangerous animals. Add Ice Age beavers to that picture, not the cute, cuddly, pond-loving creatures of modern nature documentaries, but the huge, aggressive, armoured beavers of the Pleistocene, and the image of Europe around 350,000 years ago becomes even more extreme. These humans were built for punishment. Their bodies tolerated heat radiating through volcanic ash and cold seeping upward from frozen ground. Thick plantar fat pads, reinforced ligaments, dense cortical bone, and altered pain thresholds meant that rocky slopes, sharp scree, and unstable surfaces did not immediately cripple them. Their feet and ankles absorbed shock the way modern climbing shoes try and fail to imitate. Barefoot did not mean vulnerable, it meant calibrated. That calibration extended to strength. This was not gym strength or short-burst power, it was load-bearing, endurance strength, the ability to climb repeatedly, haul wood downhill, carry stone, drag carcasses, and still function the next day. Their upper limbs show exactly what you would expect from people who used wood constantly. Powerful grips, thick forearms, and shoulders conditioned for levering, thrusting, and impact. Cold tolerance mattered as much as heat tolerance. Europe's Middle Pleistocene climate demanded circulation that kept fingers and toes useful even when numbness should have set in. You cannot nap stone, shape wood, or climb wet rock with dead hands. These people did it anyway. Their physiology bridged extremes without the heavy insulation modern humans rely on. Clothing and shelter mattered, but bodies carried much of the burden. Now add prey. If the Rockamonfina footprints already feel unsettling, they become downright shocking once you place them in who likely made them. These were not the late Neanderthals, the ones often framed as culturally conservative, pressured and fading. The hominins moving barefoot down volcanic ash around 350,000 years ago were even more Neanderthal than later Neanderthals. Closer to the raw, formative end of the lineage, harder, stronger, and less buffered by culture. Think of them as proto-Neanderthals at peak physical intensity. Earlier Neanderthals were heavier, more thick-boned, and more powerfully muscled than their later descendants. Limb bones were broader, joint surfaces larger, muscle attachment sites more exaggerated. This is not aesthetic speculation. It reflects lives lived under relentless mechanical load. These bodies were built to absorb impact, to resist torsion, to keep functioning after injury. Pain tolerance was not a personality trait. It was a physiological baseline. This matters because behavior follows bodies. A population that walks barefoot across hot volcanic ash is already operating with a different relationship to pain and risk. Add to that hunting practices that relied on close-range violence, and the picture sharpens. Before projectile weapons, before distance softened danger, hunting meant proximity. It meant plunging spears, heavy, thrusting weapons, into animals that could kill you instantly if you slipped, hesitated, or lost balance. And these animals were not polite prey. Woolly rhinoceroses were enormous, aggressive, and heavily muscled, with thick hides and lethal horns. Taking one down was not persistence hunting at a distance. It was a commitment to collision. Hunters had to close in, coordinate, distract, wound, and finish the job while the animal was still capable of charging. This kind of hunting selects for aggression, fearlessness, and a willingness to endure injury. You do not do this unless your entire nervous system is tuned for confrontation. Early Neanderthals almost certainly were. They lived in landscapes filled with other dangerous megafauna: steppe bison, giant deer, cave lions, cave bears, and the oversized, aggressive Ice Age beavers that dominated wetlands. These were not ecosystems where caution was rewarded. They were ecosystems where decisiveness kept you alive. Hesitation meant death. Aggression, strength, and cohesion meant meat, fat, fur, and survival. This helps explain the psychological dimension hinted at by rockamonfina. Descending a volcano barefoot is not just about anatomy, it is about mindset. These people did not treat dangerous landscapes as exceptions. They treated them as opportunities, places where resources were concentrated and competitors were fewer. Volcanic slopes offered stone. Uplands offered wood. Mountains offered prey and dominance. Wetlands offered dangerous but rich returns. Wood use sits at the center of this athletic ecology, and these hominins had an advanced arboreal knowledge. Their spears, balanced, aerodynamic, deliberately shaped, are the smoking gun. Woodworking at that level requires grip strength, fine motor control, endurance, and above all, selection. You do not get ideal spearwood by accident. You climb to find it. Straight trunks grow higher up slopes in thinner soils, in wind-stressed environments that produce long, resilient fibers. Harvesting such wood means moving into terrain modern humans would label extreme. For these people, it was simply where the best materials lived. And once you are climbing for wood, stone follows naturally. Uplands and mountainous regions expose bedrock, reveal hard volcanic stones for hammering, and offer durable materials for heavy-duty tools. Even if fine flint came from river gravels, the high ground supplied the infrastructure of toolmaking: anvils, hammerstones, pounding surfaces. Fire, too, was reinforced by these landscapes: wind-sheltered hollows, dry upland timber, and in volcanic regions, heat sources that blurred the line between natural and controlled fire. Minerals that could be used for fire starting come from volcanic regions, as well as rocks that can be used for pigments and glue. Ice Age beavers were not benign engineers quietly chewing willow along a stream bank. Pleistocene beavers were large, muscular, and confrontational, capable of inflicting serious damage with incisors designed to fell trees. Even the Eurasian species was more formidable than modern analogues, and in a landscape full of wetlands, oxbow lakes, and river corridors, beavers were abundant, territorial, and dangerous. Hunting them was not casual trapping. It meant entering waterlogged terrain, dealing with animals that could fight back savagely, and finishing the kill at close range. Why hunt them at all? Because beavers were resource jackpots: meat, fat, dense fur for insulation, and above all, wood infrastructure. Beavers reshaped landscapes, creating ponds and deadwood zones that concentrated fish, birds, and large herbivores. Humans who understood beavers understood ecosystems, but taking them required nerve, coordination, and bodies that could absorb bites, slips, and cold immersion without immediate collapse. This is where the ultimate adventure athlete analogy stops being metaphorical. These people climbed volcanoes for stone and perspective. They likely climbed mountains, possibly even high alpine zones, not just for travel, but for selective hunting and material acquisition. Straight spear wood, hard stone, seasonal prey, and large, dangerous animals all pulled humans upward. Cave bears in the Alps, massive herbivores on upland routes, and aggressive beavers in wetlands formed a spectrum of risk that these populations repeatedly engaged. Hunting large bears demanded power and courage. Hunting Ice Age beavers demanded close-quarters violence and control in unstable environments. Both point to the same conclusion. European humans of 350,000 years ago were not cautious generalists waiting for cognitive salvation. They were specialists in surviving and exploiting danger. This makes the rockamonfina footprints even more unsettling. A population willing to descend a volcano barefoot is a population already accustomed to pain, instability, and threat. Add volcanic heat, freezing winters, jagged rock, upland climbs, and animals that could kill you with a single mistake, and what emerges is a picture of humans whose baseline tolerance for risk was radically higher than ours. Some anthropologists struggle here because they assume that such people were brittle, ecologically narrow, technologically limited, and easy to displace. But brittle populations do not hunt aggressive megafaunal rodents in wetlands, confront cave bears near mountain caves, or climb volcanoes for resources. Brittle populations avoid those places. These people sought them out. The people of Rockamonfina lived in a Europe that demanded full-body commitment, feet tough enough for ash and stone, hands strong enough for wood and teeth marks, nerves trained to keep functioning under cold, heat and fear. They were not buffered by civilization. They were buffered by evolution itself. If they hunted Ice Age beavers, big, angry and dangerous, and still climbed volcanoes barefoot, then the idea that they were somehow inferior, marginal or waiting to be replaced collapses completely. You do not erase people like this, you inherit them. Woodworking at the level seen at Schöningen, balanced spears, carefully shaped shafts, requires not just skill, but hands that can withstand vibration, abrasion and cold while remaining precise. However, one of the most dangerous and symbolically charged resources available was the cave bear. These animals were enormous, far larger than modern brown bears, powerful, territorial, and often occupying caves that humans also coveted. Evidence from later periods shows repeated human-bear interactions in alpine and pre-alpine zones, sometimes violent, sometimes ritualized. It strains credibility to imagine that earlier Europeans, already climbing volcanoes and harvesting upland wood, simply avoided these mountains. Hunting or confronting large bears at altitude would have required extraordinary strength, coordination, and nerve. Spears had to be driven with force and accuracy. Terrain was unforgiving. Failure meant death. But success meant meat, fat, fur, bone, and dominance over the most formidable non-human competitor in the landscape. If you are already an apex climber, a heat and cold tolerant endurance athlete, the Alps are not a barrier, they are a proving ground. Seen this way, Middle Pleistocene Europe looks less like a marginal habitat and more like an arena. These humans trained themselves against the continent itself. They climbed for wood. They ranged for stone. They hunted where prey was strongest. They walked barefoot across surfaces that would cripple modern feet. Their bodies were not buffered by technology. Technology extended bodies that were already extreme. This is why Rockamonfina matters so much. The volcano is not an anomaly. It is a window into a lifestyle that demanded constant physical negotiation with danger. Some anthropologists assume that such populations were fragile, conservative, and easily displaced by a cognitively superior newcomer. The physiology exposed by these footprints makes that assumption almost absurd. You do not replace people whose bodies are already optimized for a continent by simply arriving later with better ideas. You meet them. You mix with them, you adapt to their landscapes and inherit their hard-won tolerances. The people who left footprints on Rockamonfina were not primitive precursors waiting for salvation. They were Europe's first ultra-endurance athletes, climbers, woodworkers, hunters and survivors whose strength was written into bone and footpad alike. If they climbed volcanoes barefoot, there is little reason to doubt they climbed high mountains too, following wood grain, stone seams and prey trails into places modern humans still approach with respect. Later, Neanderthals, living under harsher climatic instability and increasing competition, may actually look softer by comparison, not weaker in an absolute sense, but more constrained. By the end, Neanderthals were operating in narrower ecological windows with higher population stress and less room for reckless behavior. Their ancestors, by contrast, lived in a Europe that was still opening itself, ecologically, geographically, vertically. In that context, aggression was not a flaw. It was an adaptation. The idea that these early Neanderthals were more animalistic should not be read as an insult. It means they were closer to the edge where biology does the work technology later replaces. They relied less on insulation, distance weapons and symbolic buffers, and more on raw physical engagement with the world. Their joy, if we can use the word, may well have come from mastery through force, the successful thrust, the animal collapsing, the risk paid off. This is profoundly incompatible with narratives that portray pre-modern Europeans as fragile placeholders awaiting a cognitive revolution from elsewhere. You do not displace populations like this easily. You do not outcompete them with cleverness alone. If later Homo sapiens succeeded, it was not because they encountered timid foragers. It was because they encountered apex hominins, already forged by Europe's hardest terrains and most violent prey, and eventually mixed with them. Rockamonfina is the clue. Bare feet on hot ash, hundreds of thousands of years ago, tell us these early Neanderthals were not easing into the continent. They were dominating it, physically, psychologically, and ecologically. They climbed volcanoes, they hunted monsters, they plunged spears into animals that fought back. The real shock is not that they survived such terrain. The shock is that we ever imagined they couldn't. Thanks for watching.